Today we will talk about cognitive load theory. Professor John Sweller is with us. Thank you, Professor, for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
It will be more like an academic discussion. You are very well known in the education sector, and there are a lot of brain chemistry or brain evolving capacity theory are also around it. First question to you, or just to start off the conversation from this cognitive aspect, how our human brain evolved.
I'll I'll talk briefly about human cognitive architecture, how we learn, how we think, how we solve problems. And the first thing one needs to talk about when discussing human cognitive architecture concerns categories of knowledge. We can categorize knowledge probably in an infinite number of ways, and most of those categorization schemes are not terribly useful. But there's one categorization scheme that is particularly useful, and that was devised by an American psychologist called David Geary. And he distinguished between biologically primary and biologically secondary knowledge. Biologically primary knowledge is knowledge we have acquired over countless generations to acquire easily, effortlessly, and without any conscious thought. There are lots and lots of examples, but probably the simplest example is learning to listen to and speak our native language. We don't teach people how to listen to and speak their native language. It's one of the most complicated things we do, but for us it's easy and simple. Give you an example. If we were required to teach a child how to organize their mouth, their lips, their tongue, their voice, their breath in order to speak, we couldn't do it. Speech pathologists can do some of that, but generally speaking, for a native language, we don't need to do it. It just happens easily and automatically. We have evolved that particular skill over a very long period of time, over generation after generation. It doesn't need to be taught, and it isn't taught. In contrast, to consider a related area, we have not evolved to read and write. We can learn to read and write. Reading and writing were invented several thousand years ago. And during most of that period, the vast majority of every population could not read and write. Only a tiny minority of people ever learnt to read and write. Reading and writing became common about 150 years ago or so, when we devised mass education for everybody. That's what people required in order to learn to read and write, and indeed education as an industry, as a large industry, was invented to teach people how to read and write, teach arithmetic, teach everything else that's taught in education. We devised education to teach biologically secondary information, not biologically primary. And human cognitive architecture is organized around learning to acquire biologically secondary information. So that's the first category we need to keep in mind, that we're dealing with biologically secondary information, not biologically primary information. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is that until that distinction was made, a lot of people went around saying things like, look how easy it is for people to learn to listen and speak their first language, and how hard it is for them to learn to read and write, we're doing it all wrong. We should simply put people into a reading and writing environment and they'll automatically learn to read and write in the same way as when we put them into a listening and speaking environment, they automatically learn to listen and speak. And that was catastrophic. That was catastrophic. It doesn't work. And it doesn't work for any of the subjects that are taught in educational institutions, all the way from infant school to university. All of them are biologically secondary, and the cognitive architecture associated with the acquisition of biologically secondary information is what cognitive load theory is primarily concerned with. So that's the first point I want to make about human cognitive architecture. There's a second point with respect to categories of information. Cognitive load theory calls that particular issue element interactivity. Some information can be learned item by item without reference to any other item. For example, we can learn the nouns of a second language one word at a time. We can learn the translation of the word cat independently of the translation for the word dog. They don't relate. We can think of one of them without thinking of the other one. Element interactivity is low. And a lot of subjects are like that. Learning the symbols of the chemical tables. Learn the Fe is the symbol for iron and Cu is the symbol for copper. You can learn those independently of each other. Element interactivity is low. Other areas, element interactivity is very high. Generally speaking, in most areas of mathematics, element interactivity is high. And that means there may not be all that many elements, but the elements interact. You can't deal with one element without dealing with a whole lot of other elements. Just think of a simple algebraic equation. A plus B all over C equals D, solve for A. Okay, that's a algebra problem. A plus B all over C equals D, solve for A. Make A the subject of the equation. Now, if you know elementary algebra, then you know how to go about doing that. And one thing you might notice, you cannot make a change anywhere in that equation without considering the entire equation, all of the elements. You can't make a change to one side of the equation without simultaneously, depends on the nature of the change, without simultaneously making a change on the other side of the equation. Now, the equation itself contains, I haven't counted them, about a dozen elements or so. The rules of algebra contain a lot more elements. The consequences of any change you make results in a whole new set of elements. There's a lot of elements. You've got to consider all of that simultaneously. Not like learning the translation of the word cat and then learning the translation of the word dog. You've got a whole lot of elements that you've got to deal with simultaneously. And as we'll discover in a few minutes, that's important because of the nature of human cognitive architecture. So we divided up information into biologically primary and biologically secondary. And we've now divided up biologically secondary into low element interactivity and high element interactivity. It's convenient to consider them as categories, but that's not a category, it's a continuum. You continue from very low element interactivity to very high element interactivity. So that's the first. Categorizing information is the first step we've got to make when considering cognitive load theory. Next step, how do we acquire information, whether it's high or low in element interactivity? How do we acquire it? Well, there are two ways of acquiring information, just two ways. One way, we can acquire it by problem solving. In other words, oh, this is the situation, this is the other situation I want to get to. How do I go about doing it? Solving a problem. It's a difficult process, it's a long process, it's a slow process, but we have no alternative but to obtain information by problem solving if we can't obtain it any other way. And there is another way in which we can obtain information. Humans can obtain information from each other, exactly what we're doing now. We've become the dominant species, mammalian species on Earth, at least in part because of our unique ability to transmit enormous amounts of information between us. No other species can do that. They can transmit information to each other, but only very small amounts. We're the only species that can transfer enormous amounts of information to each other. And that's the second way we can obtain information. The first way was problem solving. The second way is by communication between us. And we can communicate either, as we're doing now, by talking to each other, but even better, we can communicate through pictures and written words. In other words, we can communicate visually. We invented writing because it turned a form of communication which is transient. What I said a few minutes ago has disappeared. You can get back to it by recording and modern technology, but generally speaking, when we talk to each other, anything we say disappears and is replaced by whatever we're saying now. We invented writing because it turns transient information into permanent information. And we can communicate in a sense, or people from several thousand years ago can communicate with us because we can read what they wrote. That's why we invented writing. So there are those two ways of communicating. So we can acquire information either by problem solving or by getting the information from other people. And getting information from other people is a far better way of doing it. It's far more efficient. We can acquire enormous amounts of information from other people. Problem solving is a long, slow process. So be wary of people who say, oh, look, problem solving is the best way of acquiring information. It's the worst way. The only reason we use that way is because we can't do it by the more efficient method of obtaining it from other people. If you're dealing with something that new, you can't obtain it from other people. If there are other people unavailable and it's not in written form, you have to solve problems. So we have to do that. And relatively speaking, we're good at doing it, but it's an inefficient method of obtaining information. So they're the two ways in which we can obtain biologically secondary information. Irrespective of how we acquire that information, the first step we have to engage in is processing the information. And what does that mean? Well, we have a structure called working memory, which processes novel information. And we're talking about novel information now, information you weren't aware of. You either had to obtain it via problem solving or you have to obtain it by listening to somebody else or reading what somebody else has written. So working memory has to process that information. And working memory, when dealing with novel information, has two unusual characteristics. The first characteristic is it is very limited in capacity. We can hold about 7 items of information in working memory at any given time. We can process 2, 3, maybe 4 elements of information. By process, I mean put together in some way, consider, deal with, organize. Just 2, 3, maybe 4 elements of information. That's it. No more than that. So that's one issue with working memory when dealing with novel information. very limited in capacity. It's also very limited in duration. We can hold information in working memory, novel information, for no more than about 18 seconds. No more than that, which is surprising. We can extend that by constantly repeating something to ourselves. You might note in the days when telephone numbers were a little bit shorter than they are now, if you came across a new telephone number which you had to dial, you could keep it in working memory by constantly repeating it to yourself. If you didn't do that, it would stay there, but for no more than about 18 seconds. After 18 seconds, pretty much all of it would be gone. So how do we function given those limitations? Well, luckily, we've got another structure called long-term memory. We can transfer information from working memory into long-term memory. If we continue to use working memory, after a while, the information will transfer across to long-term memory. And unlike working memory, long-term memory has no known limitations. Once something has been transferred from working memory to long-term memory, there seem to be no limitations to capacity of long-term memory. If it has limitations, we don't know where they are. We hold an enormous amount of information in long-term memory, and it stays there indefinitely. Indefinite capacity, indefinite time which it will be held. So long-term memory is a vastly different structure to working memory. Now, let's go to the last aspect of cognitive architecture, and everything I've said up till now really leads up to this last aspect. It's the really important one. Information in long-term memory can be transferred back to working memory. Now, in order to govern appropriate action. When I talked about working memory before, I talked about its limitations in capacity and duration. Working memory has no limitations of capacity or duration when it's dealing with information that has been stored in long-term memory. The limitations I talked about before only apply to novel information that we're getting from the environment. Information we're transferring back from long-term memory into working memory, there are no known limitations. We can transfer enormous amounts of information back into working memory from long-term memory, and we can use that information to govern action that's appropriate to whatever environment we're in. So we are at that point transformed. We become different people. Now, we know education is transformational. It changes us. I've just explained how it changes us. When something has been stored in long-term memory, we can do things, we can think about things, we can act in ways we couldn't dream of doing before that information had gone into long-term memory. So long-term memory is immensely important, and indeed it provides the justification of education, or indeed for the transfer of any information from one person to another person. If what you transfer to another person doesn't go into long-term memory, it won't have any effects. That's a very, very brief introduction to human cognitive architecture. Cognitive load theory has used that architecture to devise instructional procedures which make sense given that cognitive architecture. There's about 1.5 of those procedures. We call them cognitive load theory effects. And those effects provide an indication of how one should proceed when one is communicating information from one person to another. And of course, education is heavily involved with exactly that, communicating information from a teacher to students. Additional things that I can talk about, I won't go through all of the cognitive load theory effects. They're the instructional effects, the communication effects that flow from the theory. I said earlier on that some information is transient and other information is permanent, and that we invented writing to turn transient information into permanent information. And that leads to the transient information effect. If the information is high in element interactivity, complex information, it needs to be presented in written form, not spoken form. That's why subjects like mathematics, technical subjects, place a heavy emphasis on the written form. If all of mathematics in spoken form, we wouldn't know a great deal about mathematics, and the same goes for a large number of subjects that are taught in educational institutions, and indeed many of the subjects that we deal with in everyday life. They really rely on the written form. So we have a transient information effect when you provide learners with information in spoken form, a lot of information in spoken form, then present the same information in written form, and then test to see how much they've learned. And you find they've learned a lot more if element interactivity is high, a lot more from the written version than the spoken version. So transient information effect is one of the effects. Probably the most important cognitive load effect, and possibly the one I should have started with, is known as the worked example effect. You can give people problems to solve. Now, the problems could be a mathematics problem, or it could be a problem like write an essay on the causes of the First World War. Okay, so it could be an essay type question, it could be a mathematics type question. You can give people those problems to solve. If you give one group of students a whole lot of problems to solve, you'll find they can solve some of them they can't solve. Give them a test and see how much they've learned. Give another group of participants in the experiment exactly the same problems, give them worked examples showing them this is how you solve this problem, or this is a solution to this problem. Study the solution. So one group studies solutions, another group has to solve problems. Now note, problem solving places a very heavy load on working memory. Studying a solution reduces that load. So we predict the people who've been given the solutions to study should do better on a subsequent test than people who've been given the same problems to solve. And that's exactly the result that we obtain. And that result has been obtained on numerous occasions all over the world. It's a very, very common effect. If you want to teach somebody how to solve problems, in the first instance, give them worked examples. Don't have them practice solving problems. After they've studied lots of worked examples, then they can try solving problems for themselves. So that's the worked example effect.
So that means the whole education system and our career, so to speak, it totally depends on the secondary information which we are acquiring from outer world, right?
Exactly. That is exactly correct.
And it is kind of an ability of us which we are taking the information within those 18 seconds or repeated way from the short-term memory to our long-term memory. We are processing it and sending it back. Okay.
We're sending it to long-term memory, yes. If the education process has been successful, the information goes into long-term memory. That's correct, yes.
Right. So two questions. One is, an individual is doing this work in his brain or within himself or herself. IQ, is it related to that? Number one. And number two, because it is all external information we are processing, so external information base or how it is coming to us have also an enormous responsibility to present those in front of the individuals. Is that right?
Okay, the two questions there. The first question concerns intelligence. It is probably the case, and I'm making inferences here, and there's no guarantee that what I'm saying is valid. I don't have any data on this. It is probably the case that the difference between someone who's highly intelligent and someone who is less intelligent is that the highly intelligent person is able to more easily, more readily transfer lots of information into long-term memory. That is the only way in which we can change the structure of our thought processes. If we change what's in long-term memory, as I said earlier on, it changes us. We can do things we could otherwise not do. So an intelligent person may be, I'm not saying this with any degree of absolute certainty, an intelligent person may be somebody who can more easily, more rapidly, more efficiently transfer information into long-term memory. I think that's probably the best way I can answer that question. If that is the case, there's no such thing as an ignorant, intelligent person. If somebody's intelligent, they know things. That means they've got information in long-term memory that a lot of other people don't have. So I need to emphasize to some degree that that's speculation.
And the outer world thing?
You can organize information in such a way that it makes sense, or you can organize it in a way so that it's just random little bits of information which should be connected and which are not connected. If you provide people with highly interactive information, element interactivity is high, and you don't make clear how the elements interact, which elements interact, what the nature of the interaction is. In other words, you're more or less providing the information in a random manner. Will the students learn? Well, yeah, they'll learn, but they won't learn well. They'll have difficulty learning. So organizing the information so that the appropriate interactions between elements are clearly indicated, that assists.
So that means we are talking about teaching, we are talking about career and all these things, okay? Underline all these, or in our life, so to speak, ethics, morality, social norms, these things are also kind of an external information coming to us, right? Some we are good in that, some we are bad in that, or rather, some societies are good in that, some societies are bad in that. So, is that also our ability or our willingness to put from working memory to long-term memory, these ethics, morality, all these things?
Absolutely. But keep in mind, some of this information is biologically primary. In other words, if we have to teach our children the moral codes that govern our society, but those moral codes are going to vary from society to society, the children will automatically acquire those moral codes because socialization is largely a biologically primary function. It occurs automatically. A child will automatically acquire the moral codes, the procedures, how we should interact with each other that is relevant to their society. And that's why it can be difficult if a person goes from one society to another society, because they take their moral codes, their ethical principles, their procedures for dealing with other people. They take all of that with them, and what they take with them may be completely different what's socially acceptable in one society may or may not be socially acceptable in a different society. But children will automatically, even if they never go to school, they'll automatically pick up, probably because it's largely biologically primary, the socially acceptable actions that their society holds. And that'll change from society to society. It's those differences between societies, I might add, are reducing because of the mass communication between societies. But go back a few hundred years ago, where you had some societies with no connection to other societies, and the clash between those societies, they cause difficulties.
Whatever goes into our long-term memory, primarily or secondarily, whatever way, some of them can be not true. For example, any cult following. Okay. After that cult leader came out with he's not a very decent guy, sexual abuse or whatever happened, then the whole thing kind of crashed. Or let's say religion, it's kind of a brainwash or whatever emphasize. Okay. So in long-term memory, whatever you learn and you have that willingness, or you are in a society where you are seeing that there is a clash internally happening, can we learn it and put the right thing inside, and how long it takes normally?
Yeah, we can learn it. How long it takes to some extent depends on one's age. If you spent a whole lifetime learning what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, becomes increasingly difficult to change. That doesn't just apply to our interactions with other people in our society. It applies to a lot of our perceptions. If you look outside, there are several things that are very, very obvious to you. It's obvious, firstly, the earth looks flat. It's flat. It's obvious the sun goes round and round the earth, does it every day. How it does that over the flat earth, you don't think about. It took a long time for us to manage to suppress those perceptual signals because they were wrong. It took us a long time to discover. You know, if you look at a sailing ship going over the ocean and you realize, oh, look, why does the bottom of the sailing ship disappear first, and then midway through the sails, and then the top of the sails? Why is that happening? And you realize, gee, maybe the Earth's not flat. Those sorts of perceptual signals, the signals we get with respect to the issues you were discussing, socially appropriate and socially inappropriate behavior. Cults arise because somebody goes in with a whole lot of people who believe the same thing, which may be complete nonsense, but they all believe it and they all support each other in that belief, and they end up having, in long-term memory, issues and procedures which are vastly different to any of those that can result in a viable society.
Another thing coming in my head, because I came from India, and our
Yep.
education system was pretty much information dump on our head. Okay. Some of us, we trying to understand what subject we can love, but when the whole lot of going deep into it, then it's all about, again, information dump. For example, I really used to like mathematics, and that's why I studied mathematics honors. When I was studying mathematics honors, all the love and affection kind of disappeared because of those unnecessary, irrelevant information study. Okay. Question is, I knew now that many of the things are not going into my long-term memory. Yes, bits and pieces, mostly not. So I was dumping into my working memory, okay, so that I will pass the exam. And it was enormous stress, enormous pressure, enormous fear. Does that make you resilient?
Oh, we're going way beyond cognitive load theory here. I suspect if you have failed consistently at something, but have continued to work at it and have eventually succeeded, I think that would probably make you resilient. But I don't really have data on that. It's a vitally important issue. It's not an issue that I've studied.
So we are almost the last phase of it. So that means it's an ability of us, it's an ability of the society, or it's an ability of the system. Could cognitive load theory, or this aspect, help humanity redefine success away from productivity towards clarity, more depth, more meaning?
Look, I guess that's the ultimate intention of the theory. Yeah, it's intended to assist you to acquire information that either you've decided you need, or if you're very young, society has decided you need. That should that should assist you in your future life. The whole assumption behind education is that it's going to provide you with advantages. If you compare a society that in which most people have an education and a society in which most people do not have an education, you will, of course, see an enormous difference between those societies, with the society that's educated being far superior in most of the respects that we consider important compared to the society that's uneducated.
Definitely, how we process information from short term to long term, and how information is kind of coming to us with together. Definitely, there is a high hope that we can push the humanity towards more clarity, more meaningful, more depth.
Yeah, and I think if you look at history, that's been happening. That has been happening, and there's no reason to suppose it won't continue happening. We certainly want it to continue happening.
Thank you, Professor.